Today I'm taking on my most ambitious build to date, the split top Roubo. In this video we're going to be focusing on the top, so let's get started on Timber Biscuit. So if you're not aware what a split top Roubo is, it's basically a really large workbench. And this workbench is comprised of about 180 board foot of lumber, so it's pretty massive. Now throughout the video I'll cover more about what the workbench does and how it works, but for now let's get to breaking down the lumber. So the first thing I needed to do was to cut down my 9 and 10 foot boards into 8 foot sections. This makes the boards a little bit easier to manage, even though at this point they're still pretty large. But with the boards in 8 foot sections, it gives me about 5 extra inches on either side, so I can trim them back and eliminate some of that snipe we're going to get during the milling process. So once I had the boards milled down, I brought them over to the joiner to put one clean edge on all of them. This will give me a nice flat reference surface to rip these boards down over at the bandsaw here in a second. Now this bench design is heavily inspired by Benchcrafted and Mr. Spagnolo as far as the plans go. But Charles Schwarz was also a huge influence on me for this one, so you're going to see that throughout the build. So while I'm not going to go into detail about every dimension that I'm cutting here, I am going to go into detail about my experience with it and what I think would help you guys if you're building split top Roubo. Not to mention that this build in general has a ton of advanced woodworking techniques, so I hope you find it helpful. Alright, so with that out of the way, what I'm doing here is ripping my boards down to some pretty thick sections. I'm trying to keep my boards to around 4.5 to 5 inches, since the final top will be thickness down to about 4 inches. So anywhere we can get some breathing room in here is ideal. So once all that's done, I'm left with 14 boards that range between 4.5 to 5 inches. And from there, I can bring them over to the planer to thickness them down to the rough dimension. Here I'm aiming for the thickest, flattest boards I can possibly get. Now since these boards are already pretty flat, I'm just going to skip plane them over at the planer. But if there were some big curves or any big deviations, I'd have to joint one face first, and that would cause me to use a lot more material than I really want to. So skip planing the boards lets me conserve material, but can leave a little bow in the boards that we'll have to deal with at the glue up later on. So once I have 2 co-planar faces, I can bring the boards back over to the joiner to put a clean edge on one side. Now throughout all these processes, I highly recommend using roller stands. They allow for the boards to have a little bit of leeway when coming on and off the machines, and if there's an emergency, I can let go of the boards and they're not going to come crashing to the ground. So with one edge jointed, my next step was to thickness all the boards down so they're all the same width. And here we're shooting for about 4.25 inches. Oh, and I should mention too that by this point, all of my boards are the same consistent thickness, which at the end of all these processes will leave me with 2 slabs that are 7 boards thick and the same width. But for now, we're going to keep our front slab at 5 boards in thickness and our rear slab at 7. And that's to leave room for our dog hole strip and our front laminate. But don't worry, we'll cover that when we get there. For now, just like I tell my son all the time, you gotta trust me. Well, that and pick up your clothes. So now what I'm doing is laying out some dominoes. Given that these boards are 8 feet long, I want to make sure that I give it the best opportunity possible to keep my top and bottom flat. So what I've done here is I've flipped my boards upside down and I'm placing in some dominoes as deep as I can. What this will do is keep those dominoes away from the top of my slab, as well as give me a reference for the bottoms of all my boards. Now even with these dominoes in here, during the glue up, the boards are going to want to shift a little bit, so we're going to have to address that with a hand plane. But something like dominoes, biscuits, or dowels will dramatically cut down on the stress during the glue up. And as I've covered countless times on the channel, if there's anything I can do to avoid stress during that time, I do it. Alright, so with offsetting dominoes cut on all my boards, I could go ahead and start the glue up. Now since I have a stack of cherry boards, I'm going to go ahead and use a roller to apply my glue. This will give me a nice even coat, as well as make applying the glue a heck of a lot faster. And while I'm applying that glue mayo to my wood sandwiches, let's talk a little bit about the lumber choice. For my bench, I decided to go with a combination of 8/4 cherry and 8/4 walnut. And that's partly because I really love working with cherry, but it's also not an overly dense species, so it's not going to ding up projects that I work on the bench. And the combination of walnut will give it some nice contrast and pop on those accents that I really want it to. Plus cherry's right there at 950 on the Janka hardness scale, which is equivalent of something like a maple that you traditionally see these benches made from. So once I have my slab completely assembled, I could throw on a ton of clamps and squeeze the crap out of them. And then I'll follow the same process for the 7 board slab, but we don't need to go over that since we just watched it. Alright, so with the glue dry and the clamps removed, I just use a glue and paint scraper to scrape away any of that excess squeeze out. And it's worth noting that I also used this while the slab was still in clamps, but I forgot to film that part. Sorry. From there I can start flattening the bottom of my slabs. And to do that, I'll just use a number 4 smoother. Once I got the front edge flat, I could use a set of winding sticks to sight down the slab and remove any of the imperfections that I could see. Now every slab is going to have slightly different variances in it, so I'd caution you from just going to town using a smoother. But for the most part, you just want to work in sections, moving your way down the slab and removing any of those imperfections. You're trying to make this as flat as possible so that when you put it through the planer, it has a nice reference face for the bed and gives you a nice coplanar top to your bench. I would venture to say that more important than a perfectly flat bottom is a 90-degree face to your bench. So if it's not perfectly flat, you can bring the smaller slab over to your joiner and give it a nice square face, which is actually what I ended up doing with my smaller slab. But for the larger slab that won't fit across the joiner, that one just takes a little bit of time. So my recommendation is to get yourself a set of winding sticks. In my case, I used some aluminum T-track and get to work. So once I had the bench mostly flat, I just went across it one time with my number 4, then back across on the other direction. And we're good to go. From there, I just took the smaller slab over to the joiner and took one light pass. Now by this point, these things are super heavy. So if you have anybody that can help you move these in the shop, I highly recommend you do so. Thankfully, my wife was around for this process, so she helped me put them in position so I didn't have to worry about dropping them. Then with my flattened side down, I could run both slabs through the planer. And hey, if you're enjoying this build so far, be sure to give it a like. It helps the video spread to more people, and I really appreciate the support. Thank you. So with the smaller slab thickness down to 4 inches, I could repeat the process with the larger slab, only this time using a little bit of assistance. Shout out to the supportive spouses. Alright, so with the 2 slabs thickness down, I could start trimming them down to their final length. But for now, I'll leave the front slab long on the leg vise end, and then we'll trim that to length after we get the front laminate on. So to trim these down, I'm going to lay out a line that wraps around my entire end. And I'm doing this on the end where the tail vise will go, because installing it will be the next step. So I use an X-Acto knife to scribe in a line, and then reinforce it with a pencil. This just makes the line a lot easier to see. So I start this process off the front face and the top. And when I'm done, if everything is square, my 2 ends of my line should meet up perfectly. And thankfully here they did, but if they didn't, I would need to go back to my joiner and square up the front. But since we're good, we can go ahead and trim this off. And to do that, I'm going to use my track saw. Now my track saw obviously doesn't plunge deep enough to cut all the way through the slab, so I'm going to have to do this in 2 passes. And what it's going to do is leave me with a small bit in the center that I'll have to cut off by hand. But that's no matter, that's what a flush trim saw is for. So I will say that nailing this cut is one of the trickier parts of this build so far. If for whatever reason your 2 cuts aren't lined up perfectly, you can always go back and flush them up using a hand plane. So don't worry. Now here what I'm doing is using my block plane to remove that center ridge, and I'll sand this back later on when the time comes. For this particular end, it's not super important anyway, since we're going to be cutting the tenon for our end cap into it. So with the right end of my front slab trimmed down, I could repeat that same process for the rear slab on both ends. And since we just had practice on that right front end, I think that it makes nailing these 2 just a little bit easier. Now, what I'm going for here is my end dimension of 87 inches, which again is going to be the overall dimension for the final bench. And as I've just realized I haven't mentioned the overall dimensions for this bench yet, I'll go over them now. So the bench is going to be 24 inches wide, 87 inches long, and 35 inches tall, which is perfect for my size and the type of woodworking I do. If you're a lot taller or a lot smaller, then you may need to adjust the height. Or if a bench that size wouldn't fit in your shop, you obviously can adjust the length. So what I'm doing here is laying out that pretty massive tenon we were talking about earlier. And this is going to fit right into our end cap, so we want to get this as accurately as we can to the center of our slab. So once I have it all laid out, I'll just use my track saw to remove the material that I need to start the tenon shoulder. Then I'll use my track saw to remove more material so that I can establish the tenon face. And I just did this by taking multiple passes, removing as much material as I could. And again, I'm being careful to stay on my line here so that I don't overcut my shoulder. To cut the edge of the tenon, I'll just flip my workpiece up and cut the shoulder there. For this cut, I'm undercutting to make sure that I don't go anywhere near my line, and I'll sneak up to that with some chisels in a second. From there, I could release a little tension, both figuratively and physically, and remove some of that extra material. With the excess out of the way, I could start working on the tenon edge. Here, just stayed a hair away from my line again, so that I could sneak up to the cut with my chisels. And while I sneak up to that cut, let me sneak in a segue to say, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. I put out new videos all the time about woodworking tips, tricks, and furniture builds, so if you're enjoying this one, you'll probably enjoy the others. And since this is a 2-parter, you're definitely going to want to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks. So now that I have the edge exposed, I can start cleaning up the face, which again sounds like a conversation I'd have with my son. Anyway, I'm going to use my chisel to knock down some of those larger pieces, and then I'll come back with my shoulder plane to knock down the high spots. Here I'm just going for 2 flat faces all the way across. Again, trying my best to keep them in the center. Now, if you don't have a large shoulder plane like this one or a rabbet plane, you could just plane these down using a block plane and then come back and flush that up using a chisel. Really what we're trying to do is knock down those high spots so that we have a nice flat face. For the area where I undercut the tenon, I'm just going to use my chisels to flatten out that top edge and then use that to reference against my plane and come back and flatten out any of those high spots. And it's also important to make sure that that top edge is flush so that when the end cap goes on, you don't see a gap when viewing the top of the bench. And as you can see here, we did a pretty good job. If anything, we're a little under in the center, which is fine. Alright, so the next step was to lay out the mortise for the screw on the Benchcrafted tail vise. Now this thing's pretty big, so we're going to use a router with an edge guide to carve it out. So to stabilize the router base, I just jointed a board and then clamped it on using some parallel clamps. Now the parallel clamps are doing two things here. They're both holding on my sacrificial piece, as well as acting as a stop for my edge guide. So good job, parallel clamps. So the bit I'm using here is a 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit. And the reason I'm using an upcut bit is to help pull the chips up and away from the bottom of the mortise. Since there's a ton of material to remove, I much prefer this to a straight bit for this type of cut. But if you have a favorite bit for cutting mortises, let me know what it is down in the comments. So this process does take a little bit of time because I only remove about a 1/2 inch with each pass, with a final full depth pass removing about a 1/16 of an inch off the back wall to make sure everything's nice and flush. And then from there I can grab some chisels and clean up the right side of the mortise. Now, while this isn't super important since no one will really ever see it, I know it's there and you know it's there, so let's clean it up. I'll also say there's a fair amount of mortise and tenon joinery ahead of us, so any practice that we can get, let's take it. So once I have the bulk of the material removed, I just shave down the edges to make sure that I have a nice clean face. Though I honestly wouldn't know much about that these days. Alright, so the next step is to mark out the tenon on our end cap. And for the end cap, I'm going to be using the one piece of scrap that I have that's 12/4. Luckily, it fit perfectly for this project, so I'm thankful for that. This is one of those rare times where I feel vindicated that I saved things. So with the mortise all marked out, I could use my router and edge guide again, along with my spiral bit to remove the material. Here I just took it slow and plunged down until I reached the final mortise depth, which for this one is pretty deep. This is definitely one of those projects that forced me to trust my tools and my settings. In the past I've had plunge routers that have slipped off the setting or plunged past what I had set, but thankfully that never happened on this project, so that was a huge confidence boost. And after a few passes, it was ready for a test fit. And thankfully it fit pretty snug. I did have to go back and use a shoulder plane on the tenon for a couple passes, but nothing major. All it needed was a little tabby tappy. Next I could use the template to lay out the drill holes for the end cap. Now there's a ton of different holes that go into the end cap, and all of those are laid out based on the template from Benchcrafted, so I'm not going to cover what each one is, but just know that this thing's pretty accurate, and as long as you line it up perfectly, it works great. So once I had all the holes laid out, I could bring the piece over to my drill press and start drilling some holes. Now this first one's going to be a counterbore. So I start with the larger Forstner bit and then work my way down to the smaller 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit. And this one is going to be a through hole. But since my drill press only plunges to 2 inches, I had to take this in 2 different passes. So what I did was just raise the bed of the drill press up slightly so that the drill bit started inside the hole. This gave me enough clearance to be able to plunge those deeper holes for this project. And I had to do that quite a few times throughout this build, but sometimes you just got to work with the tools you got. Another option would be just to use these as a starter hole and then use a hand drill to finish the holes off at the bench. And I do that later on in the project for some of the dog holes, but again, we'll get into that when we get there. For now, I found this to be the easiest way to keep things at 90 degrees, and I think it worked out well. So once I did 2 through bolts counterboard for the end cap, I could start cutting the slotted holes for those bolts. And what that means is I'll plunge in 3 holes at the drill press for each hole. This way, if there's any seasonal movement, there's plenty of room for the bolts to move in the end cap and they won't split it. So once I have my first hole plunged, I just move the end cap over slightly so I can plunge the second and third holes. This is by far the easiest way that I've found to cut slotted holes like this. Alright, so with the work wrapped up over at the drill press, I could take the end cap and place it back over the tenon and drill those starter holes into the end of my tenon for those bolts. Again, here I'm just trying to line it up with the center of my slotted hole so that things stay centered. This part's especially important because in order for our barrel nuts to line up with our bolts, we want to keep things as straight as possible. Now I was off slightly with mine, and all I did was sight down the bolts to be able to line up those barrel nuts again, but you really want to try to keep these as straight as you can. So once I had my initial holes drilled, I could just remove the end cap and use those as a guide to finish drilling the holes. And it's also important to note that I want to go past where I want to put the barrel nuts here, so the threads on the bolts have room to go past the barrel nuts. So once I knew where my barrel nuts needed to live, I could go ahead and drill those in. And for that, I'm just going to use a Forstner bit. Now this did take a little while because I didn't have a better bit than a Forstner bit to do these, but I did eventually get there, even if it killed a couple batteries along the way. I'll also say that putting a square next to the drill really helped me keep things aligned for the plunge. So, pro tip. So after about 10 minutes of drilling and 2 batteries, I could finally attach the bolts to the barrel nuts. And here we're not trying to tighten these down all the way, we just want to snug them up so that we can work with the rest of the end cap. If you're finding this part tricky, as I did, you may want to use a Sharpie to mark where the hole location is on the barrel nut. I found it a lot easier to line it up that way. From there, we can flip it over and see how the top of the bench turned out. Nice. Alright, so next it's time to lay out the holes for our dog hole strip. And to do that, I'm going to mark about 1 5/8 inch from the end, and then mark out a dog hole every 4 inches. I will leave about an 8-inch gap where our leg vise goes so that we don't drop a dog hole into our clamping area. Now there's a ton of debate on whether you should use square dog holes or round dog holes. I ultimately went with round dog holes because of their versatility. A lot of tools out there use round dog holes, and I'd like to use those tools, so I went with the round dog hole. And the size of the dog holes I'm using are 3/4 of an inch. There are options to do 1-inch dog holes out there, but again, I think that the 3/4 inch dog hole is much more versatile. But again, that's personal preference, so if you prefer the square dog hole or the round dog hole, let me know down in the comments. So for this process, I got a brand new 3/4 inch bit, and this thing works fantastically. And I used it first over at the drill press to start all of my dog holes, and then I finished them off with my hand drill on the bench. Since there's 17 holes total, including the dog block, I found this to be the fastest and easiest way to do all these dog holes. My only real tip here would be to charge up all your batteries before you start this process, because it definitely does a number on them. Once I had things recharged though, it went pretty quickly. And from there, I could start plunging in the dominoes so we could attach the dog hole strip. The dog strip aligns to right where the tail vise mortise is, so that makes lining it up pretty straightforward. So from there I could repeat the process of applying a bunch of glue and a crap ton of clamps. And that's probably something I should mention for this project. This project uses more clamps than I have for any other project that I've actually ever made. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're able to get a bunch of clamps for this project from a neighbor or a friend, or if you see a sale on clamps before you start this project, I would definitely recommend you do so because you're going to use them. I would say in total you could get by with about 12 clamps, but you're going to have to space out your glue ups if you do it that way, so just keep that in mind. And when we're talking about glue ups, we're obviously talking about time for this project, and in total this project took me 12 full days. But since you likely won't be filming your progress, you could probably do it a little quicker. Or if you want to take your time with it, I think this is a fun project to hop in and out of. Alright, so with the top of our dog hole strip planed down, we could start focusing on that front laminate. And the first thing we need to do is lay out our massive Condor tails. And I always start by making sure that the end of my board is square before laying out any of my dovetails. And once I'm confident that they are, I go ahead and start laying out the spacing for the ends of my tails. Next I set my bevel square to 7 degrees and lay out the ends for my tails. And I do this process on both sides of the board. Now with these dovetails, you can get as creative as you want with some houndstooth or whatever you want to do. As most of you know, I love simplicity, so I just went with 2 large tails for my bench. From there I can bring the workpiece over to my bandsaw to cut them out. And to cut them out, I'm just going to use this jig that I made with a screw and a 7-degree angle cut. This allows me to slide the whole jig along the fence and cut the tails out evenly on each side. And because I'm using a nice big resaw blade, it leaves me with pretty smooth surfaces, so I won't really have to do any cleanup with my chisels, which for this process is nice. So once I have the first set of tails cut, all I have to do is flip the board over and cut the second set in. That's the beauty of using a jig like this. It automatically centers the tails in the board, and I don't really have to think about it. I just have to set up the initial cut on my line, and I'll know that both lines will ultimately line up in the end. And you can use the same setup for any size dovetail. They don't have to be monsters like this guy. And then to remove the waste at the pins, I just take a few more passes. From there I take the piece back over to the bench and cut the shoulder using a pole saw. I hear I'm careful to say about a 1/16 of an inch away from the line, so I can establish a nice shoulder with my chisels. At this point we really don't want to cut into our shoulder or our tails, so definitely take your time with this one. Since I use a marking gauge, dropping my chisels on that line is super easy. All I have to do is give my chisel a couple taps with the mallet, and it really reinforces that line. From there I can break off a few small pieces and really establish that shoulder. And do the same process around the entire shoulder. This way I have a nice square edge for my chisels to reference. Though for clearing out the remaining material, I do try to stay away from this line as much as I can. This way I don't risk overcutting it. If anything, what we want to do is undercut these so that we leave that edge alone. And what I mean by that is scooping out the remaining material that's inside the shoulder. Here we want a really square perimeter to our shoulder, but the inside of it doesn't really matter as much, since no one's ever going to really see it. And if it is undercut or scooped out, that gives us plenty of room for glue or any little scrap bits that could be remaining in the joint. We don't want the joint to be overly tight, and if we scoop out a little bit more material than we need to there, it's going to make the outside of the joint look a lot cleaner. Now that's not to say you should go crazy here. There's about a 32nd of an inch undercut is plenty. Or if you feel super confident and you think everything's perfectly square, you don't have to undercut it at all. With tails this large, I just chose to err on the side of caution. So once I had the outside material of my shoulders cleared out, I could go ahead and start working on that center pin. And to remove the bulk of the material, I'll just use my mortising chisel, and then work my way through the wider blade bench chisels to some thinner ones to get out the material in the corners. The inside of the corners of the tails can be kind of tricky, so I was just careful and used some smaller chisels to really work my way in there, making sure not to cut any material away from the tails. Once I had all the material removed, I again checked everything for square, making sure that the outside of my shoulders lined up perfectly. And since everything looked good, we could go ahead and lay out the ends of our tails onto the end of our end cap. Once I had those marked out, I brought the whole end cap over to my table saw and trimmed it down to its final length. Now for this cut, I'm just going to use my miter gauge, but do be aware that there's a lot of blade exposed for a cut like this, so here I'm just taking my time, making sure to make a nice smooth cut. With my end cap cut to length, I removed about 1/4 inch of material from the back side of my tails. This will establish a rabbet on the backside shoulder of the tails, making laying out the pins for these massive tails a heck of a lot easier. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, as you can see mine aren't. We're just looking to remove about 1/4 inch of material and then really clean up that shoulder like we did the rest of the tails. Again, just be careful when you're doing this, because it's not like you can go to a retail store to get another set. Whew, that was pushing it even for me. Alright, so now it's time to lay out our sockets. And first what I'm going to do is mark a line around my tails. And from there I'll tap the board over slightly to where I can scribe a marking line about halfway through the center of my pencil marks. From there I'll tap the tails back over to the other side and repeat that process. This should allow for the tails to drop right into the sockets without overcutting the sockets or undercutting the sockets. From there I clamped on a support board and started to remove the material using a templating bit. Here I'm just taking light passes until I'm about 1/2 inch into my socket, which in this case would have been 2 passes. Then from there I can just take my chisels and square off that outside edge of the socket. This way I don't have to focus on getting a perfectly chiseled socket all the way through this end grain, and I can use my templating bits. Now I did take about 4 passes using my 1/4 inch templating bit until I had enough space to use my 1 inch templating bit, in which case I could take out the remaining material. This was a pretty high anxiety moment, so I just took my time and trusted my tools. From there, it was just a little bit more cleanup to try to get the tails to fit in snugly, which is not the same as snuggly, though I suppose that could work too. Here I didn't fully seat the tails, just because I didn't want to risk breaking them getting them back out, so here I just had to trust that they were going to fit in the end. And what I did do was add a small chamfer onto the bottom side of the tails to make sure that they would fit into the sockets easily. And from there, gluing on the front lamination was the same as gluing in the dog hole strip. So while we tidy that up, I'd like to take a moment and say that if you're enjoying these videos and you find them helpful or useful and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, an invite to the Discord server, and some other free stuff. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, be sure to check out the link in the description. And for those of you who've already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. It's your donations that allow me to do this. So thank you. Alright, so with the glue dry, I could cut my front slab to the 87 inch final length. And to do that, I'm just going to follow the same process that we did earlier in the video. From there, it was time to install the rails for our tail vise hardware. So the first thing I needed to do was test out the width of the mortise with the rails, and for me, it fit perfectly. If it was a little too wide or a little too tight, I would need to adjust the gap here, but since everything seems to be aligned well, I didn't have to do much. From there, I could just mark out the spacing for the rails and the depth of cut for the mortise. Here, just made sure to measure from the top of the bench rather than the bottom to make sure that the mortise was the correct depth. Next, I just used a 3/4 inch straight bit in the router, plus my edge guide, to cut the mortises in. One thing I didn't mention earlier that I should have is when I'm cutting mortises, I always work from left to right, and I try to keep the material that I'm cutting into on the far side away from the guide. This way I have the best control over the router. Alright, now that we've made a mess in the shop, we can go ahead and clean up those rounded edges that were left by the bit. From there, we could drill in a couple pilot holes using our rails as guides, and then remove the rails and finish drilling in the holes. Now while installing this tail vise, it's important to check the vise operation multiple times during the installation. At any time, things could shift and cause binding in the vise, and we definitely don't want that, as this thing should be buttery smooth. So once I tested the operation and was happy with the fit, I could go ahead and loosely drive in the outer 4 screws. Since these screws are super long, I did add a little bit of wax to the end of the tips to ensure they drove into the wood a little bit more easily. And the reason we start with the outer 4 screws is because if there's any issues, it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot than if all the screws were installed at one time. So once each screw was driven in, I did go back and test the function of the vise just to make sure that everything was working well. Once I had all the screws installed, I could go ahead and install the mounting bolts for the flange, and then once again test the functionality. From there I could get to work on trimming down the dog block. And to do that, I'm just going to mark things out and then use my crosscut sled to cut it down. There's a small notch that needs to be cut into the dog block, so once I marked that out, I took the piece over to my bandsaw and notched it out. Here just made sure to make the nicer drill hole face towards the top of the bench. Now we're going to have to flatten this whole bench top at the end of the project anyway, so if there is a little tear out, it's not going to be the end of the world, but we'll save that for the next part. And then from there I tested the fit, and mine was a little snug, so I just used my number 4 to finesse it. And once I felt like the dog block slid pretty effortlessly, I could go ahead and secure it down. Once I pre-drilled the holes, I got under the bench and drove in those 2 screws. I did use a little bit of wax on these threads again because the screws are pretty monstrous. And even then it was still pretty difficult, so I flipped the bench over and finished them off from the top. And that's going to wrap up the first part of this build. So next time we'll focus on the mortise and tenon base joinery, the massive leg vise chop, and all the small details to getting this bench finished. But believe me when I say, the end is worth it. So we're about halfway through with a ton of work left to do. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you're looking for more sawdust glory, check out this video over here next, and I'll see you next time.